we are doing the part 2 of the impact of the United States crisis, the Great Depression, and how it affected the rest of the world. So other countries that it also affected was Germany. Right, so Germany's Weimar Republic was struck very hard by the Great Depression. Now, what is the Weimar Republic? So it just means it was the name of the government of that time. After the First World War, Germany was required to make enormous reparations. Remember, Germany was blamed for the First World War, so they had to do reparations. And reparations is payments made by a defeated country to cover war damages. And this was demanded by the Treaty of Versailles. So to pay these reparations and rebuild its industries, Germany relied heavily on loans from the United States. And when the American economy collapsed during the Great Depression, the United banks recalled their loans. They couldn't do that anymore. This caused the German banking system to crash. Businesses and industries failed and unemployment soared, especially in the big cities. By 1932, nearly 30% of Germans were unemployed. Once in power, Hitler introduced a huge work creation program that drastically reduced unemployment by 1936. Young men were drafted into public work projects, paramilitary organizations, and later into the army when he began rearmament. And that means Germany started to rebuild its armed forces. These programs not only reduced joblessness but also stimulated industrial growth. To prevent inflation from spiraling out of control, consumption was limited through rationing and trade controls. So this severe economic hardship created space for extremist political parties like with Hitler, both left-wing and right-wing, to gain support. The Communist Party, or the KPD, and the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, were the biggest beneficiaries. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power, promoting his policy of Nazism, which is an ideology built on nationalism, dictatorship, and racial superiority. And this marked the first step towards the Second World War. Then it also had an impact on Japan. Japan was a growing industrial nation, dependent on exports to fund its import needs, so fuel and raw materials. And they were also hit hard by the depression. The Japanese silk industry, which was its most important staple, so their main export product, they suffered when Western chemical companies created artificial silk substitutes because it was cheaper, and the demand for the real silk collapsed. Luxury goods markets shrank and unemployment spread rapidly. Between 1929 and 1931, the value of Japanese exports fell by 50%. And real incomes dropped by nearly a third, and more than 3 million people became unemployed. Many rural regions faced famine and starvation. To tackle this crisis, Japan's finance minister introduced measures that proved more successful than America's New Deal. He used deficit spending, and that is where the government spending of borrowed money to boost the economy. So to stimulate the economic activity, and devalued the Japanese currency, and this made exports cheaper abroad, which immediately helped industries. Japanese textiles, for example, were able to displace or take the place of the British textiles in foreign markets. So by 1930s, Japan's industrial output began to recover. with heavy industry. So they started to do steel and machinery to replace textiles. So deficit spending boosted jobs, increased demand for goods. However, much of this revenue was redirected to military buildup. By 1940, the productions of munitions and weapons had become central to Japan's economy. So South Africa was also affected, but they avoided complete collapse during the Depression because of its gold mining industry. So as international investors pulled their money from stock markets, they then put it into the gold shares, which rose then rapidly. And this increase in gold exports helped balance the loss of other forms of trade. However, the wider South African economy was still badly affected. Between 1925 and 1933, the prices of agricultural products and minerals fell by 75%. Many farmers, especially the poor Afrikaner bywoners, who was tenant farmers, they did not own the land but they rented, and they could not pay their debts anymore, and they were forced off their farms. The Carnegie Commission on Poor Whites, reporting in 1931, found that nearly 1/3 of Afrikaners lived in deep poverty. And drought conditions during that time made life in rural areas even worse. South Africa's currency was tied to the gold standard. And the gold standard means a system where the value of money is linked to a fixed amount of gold, which kept South Africans' goods expensive on the world market. But in 1932, the government abandoned this gold standard, making exports cheaper and boosting economic recovery. And this decision began a new phase of growth in the South African economy. The South African government used the crisis, particularly the struggles of the Afrikaner farmers, to fuel Afrikaner nationalism, which was a political movement to sought to promote Afrikaner culture, language, and political dominance. And the nationalism eventually led to the National Party's rise to power in 1948 and the establishment of apartheid.
Thank you, and remember to subscribe.